Good evening. Thank you for joining me. I'm Jared Morris, and this is Settled Christianity, coming at you with a new video, hoping to help you get settled in the Christian faith. And honestly, this week is very important, very big video. This is just a few days. It'll be coming out Sunday, so it'll just be 2 days before Christmas. And honestly, Christmas time is all about Jesus coming to the world in human flesh to live among us as humans, as mortals, to feel our pain, to live a life of perfection among us, and eventually die on the cross. And we all know that story. But it is important, I believe, to look every year at his birth and at the Incarnation. And specifically, the video that you're watching, obviously you're here, the video is about the importance of the Incarnation. What is the significance of Jesus coming and being in the flesh? And we're going to look at three things. These are some pretty big things, and I feel particularly practical points and very good points when studying the Bible. It's what we're going to be looking at today. I'm super excited about it. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. So the first point of what is the significance of the Incarnation is that it brings importance to the Old Testament. I'll explain. I got a few verses here. It says in 1 Peter 1, 10 and 11, it says, "Of which salvation the prophets have inquired and searched diligently, who prophesied of the grace that should come unto you, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ which was in them did signify, when it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ, and the glory that should follow." An idea really is that the Old Testament, as amazing as it is, as grand as it is, and honestly being the Word of God, it is an incomplete story. That the Old Testament tells the story of a broken world. It tells the story of the fall of man, the destruction that sin has brought in. And we see this all the way through it. We see it in Genesis, at the creation, the fall of man, and I actually have a verse here in a moment that I'm going to look at. All the way through the prophets, the fall, the continual failure of the nations and of people to rise up and be faithful to God. And the fact is that without the New Testament, without the incarnation of Christ, the Old Testament becomes pointless. It becomes with nothing to point to, nothing to direct towards. And this is what Peter is talking about, that the prophets, the reason they came, the reason they preached, the reason they prophesied was all to point forward to Christ. That was their purpose. That was what they were sent to the earth to do. That's the goal that they were given. And we see this idea also in Genesis 3:15, very famous verse. It talks about, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman." This is God talking to Eve and the serpent after the fall. So I will put enmity between thee and the serpent, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. This is actually talking to the serpent, not Eve. But we find that God tells him that what's considered, he tells Satan in what's considered the first prophecy about Jesus, that you shall bruise his heel, and he shall bruise your head. And he's talking about the crucifixion. He's talking about Jesus overcoming him on the cross, defeating Satan. And this is super important that we find in the Old Testament and also just in world history, the effects of sin, the effects that Satan has left on the world and sin has left on the world. And we look and we find that even in the very beginning, in the first people, in the first prophecy, God was saying, this is not done. This is not over. There is more to this story. And this is why the Incarnation is so important. It's because it gives a point to the Old Testament. And the second point we're going to look to is it shows the character of God. The Incarnation shows the character of God. Obviously, in the Old Testament, we see a little bit of God's character. There's some places that it shows more than others. But I've heard it said this way, that the Old Testament, God was seen as a sketch, basically. You didn't really see, the full color of God. You didn't see the full depth and detail of God in the Old Testament. The prophets did not fully understand everything about God. And also, we don't either, but we get to see more of God and God's character than anyone else in history, and it was because of Christ. It is because of him coming in the flesh. And we have here two verses, both well known, but super important, very relevant to this topic. In John 1:14 says, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." I like how John describes this, is that, the Word was made flesh, talking about Jesus being God, came and dwelt among men, and we beheld him, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That's what it was like seeing Jesus. That John said we looked on him and we saw more of God's grace and we saw more of God's truth than we had ever seen before in history. And this so perfectly encapsulates that when Jesus came, it was showing God's love and God's mercy and God's justice more than at any other point in history. And the people before that could not understand God as fully as we do now, having the Bible and being able to look back onto Jesus' life and his ministry. And we see this also in Colossians 1:15. He says, "Who is the image," talking about Jesus, "who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature." See, he's talking about that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. When we look on him, we are looking on God himself, talking about obviously them back then who got to be with him, but also us when we get to read the Bible and we get to see how Jesus acts in all these different situations, how he reacted in these moments of great tension, of great controversy, where people try to catch him on sayings and hypothetical situations. And he came out with so much glory and so much grace, and because he is God. And this is the importance, secondly, of the incarnation. The significance is that it shows the character of God. And finally, and this one I feel is overlooked a lot at Christmas time, this is one that's really been on my mind a lot, is that the incarnation shows God is willing to suffer for us. And the reason I say that this is forgotten about a lot at the time of Christmas, when thinking about the incarnation, is obviously we reserve this idea usually for Easter. We save that for the crucifixion, we save that for the cross. When we look at the baby Jesus in a manger, we don't think, oh, suffering, that baby came to suffer for us. But he did. That the reason he came was to suffer for us and to give us an example. We have probably the most famous Old Testament passage about Jesus, if not one of the most famous in the Old Testament period. In Isaiah 53:3, it talks about talking about the suffering servant, says, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." He's talking about Jesus there. He says, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. This was describing Jesus. That, yes, Jesus was loving and he was kind and he lived a perfect life, but he was well acquainted with sorrow and grief and the struggles of life. I was looking over here in Matthew in chapter 2. He talks about that in verse 16, when his family flees to Egypt and the wise men are told by the angel to go back home from another way, apart from Herod. It says that Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. And this is the thing, is that even in the earliest days, as Jesus grew up, there came a time when he was aware that there were people, babies, who died because of him. That he had friends, who die, as we see later on with Lazarus, which we see friends of him who comes and needs healing, who needs help, and we see the grief that he has in his life. And the idea is that, yes, Jesus came and he came to be born as a baby, and yes, that is about living a good life and being an example to us, but the major reason he came, as told by the Bible, is to suffer and to die for us. So when we think about Christmas and the Incarnation, we need to remember that this child did come for us, and he came to suffer for us. And we need to be living that in our lives today. We need not just be living that in Christmas time, but all the time, all throughout the year. And so I hope this has been really helpful. I'm hoping to be pretty consistent on releasing videos on Sundays now. And, as I hope to grow, I'm really excited for the new year, making more interesting content, branching out. But that will be for a later time, explaining all of that. But right now, I'm just going to say that thank you for watching. I hope you got something from it. I'll be praying for you. And please like the video, subscribe, and share it with those who you feel like it would help. Thanks for everything.